Can riders understand how important data is? Run with cameras on their bikes, or just measure themselves against whether they're faster than their mates or slower than their mates?
Well, I think it's about perception. Some people will understand data quite quickly and get into the groove of it. Some people will really struggle, but they will be good in other areas. I'm trying to get people to look at it in as many different ways as possible. Because as I say, some people get it straight away, but others who can't need to come at it from maybe a different angle, using visual clues, and then look at the data in slightly different ways so they actually get on board with it. And once the penny drops, it's brilliant, and then you kind of get into it. I'm learning all the time. I mean, I've learned a few things recently with the data, which has helped me explain it and understand it better for me. So it's like an organic thing, I think. Having a camera on board the bike, particularly if you, like I have it on the headstock, so it's looking at the instruments, is a form of data in itself. It's visual data. You know where you are on the track. You can look whether you make apexes and things like that. And it also, on the assumption that you can actually see the screen clearly enough, you can utilise your timer, which is on the bike, your traction control, well, all the things which are on a modern superbike screen, you can actually use in the form of data. And then if you can link the actual real data into that as well, you've got you're coming at it from both sides then.
Surely loads of riders can remember what they've just done out on track. They'll know whether they need to go full gas at turn 3 or harder brakes at turn 4. Well, surely they can just remember what they need to do next time.
No, you can't. Most cyclists are simple creatures, me included. I struggle to remember what I did one lap to the next. Obviously, if you have a big moment, you can they're like a spike in your memory. You tend to remember stuff, but often when let's say for instance, you're looking at a data stream which has got maybe 6 or 7 laps on it, unless you absolutely have the track to yourself and you're super consistent, you're going to see variables. And some of those variables might be a mistake. Some of them might be, you've selected the wrong gear, or you've run offline, or you've gone a bit hot into a corner, or you get a back marker. So that's one of the advantages with having an onboard camera and then hook that into your data is if you see a moment or you see sort of something, a queer thing happen on the data trace, you can then find that lap on the video and you can help to identify, was it a problem or an improvement. You can sometimes see an improvement on that, and then you can bring in the visual to kind of help you.
So if we've just got a camera, how can you tell the difference between 2 laps? Can we look at that?
What I've done here is these are 2 laps from Navarra. This is a screen on the left and the screen on the right are basically 5 seconds difference, which is quite a big lump of time to lose on a track. But what it shows here is to a point where it's happening, and the actual difference by the time you get back over the line. When you're physically riding the bike, you sometimes don't realise how much of time that you're actually losing, because they can feel relatively similar when you get out there.
Okay, can we have a look at this?
So let's have a look at this. Out to the last corner, running over the start-finish line, down to effectively turn 1 and 2. There's very little in it as we cross the start-finish line. Turn 1 and turn 2, particularly turn 1 we're going through now, is super fast. And it's on the faster sections of track, particularly when you're learning, that you tend to lose or gain the biggest amounts. Run a little wide here on the slower lap. Consequently, I'm out of position, ready for turn 3 and the drop down the hill. So going through turn 3, on the good lap, I'm significantly faster. And if you're faster at coming onto the straight, no matter how, on the assumption you're on the same bike, you're never going to make that time back up, because both bikes effectively are flat out and accelerating the same. So if you're carrying speed onto the straight, you've got the advantage straight away. Here you can see I've got a back marker which put us out of line, so I'm going to lose speed into the corner, lose a little bit of position running around the corner. From here on, it's what I would call both clean laps. There's nobody gets in the way, and more or less on line for most of the corners that you're going around. And what you will see later when we look at the data, the majority of the time has already been lost, and I'm losing a little bit through the rest of the lap. But the big time happened effectively between turn 3 and turn 4. The run down the hill is where the biggest stretch of time happened, and then it's little bits here, there, and everywhere. When you look at your timesheet and you see a massive gap, a massive lump of time, you're kind of running around like a headless chicken trying to figure out where's that time gone. But you've got to try and break it down into sections, and you'll tend to find the biggest lumps of time are often lost on the faster corners, because that's kind of where the biggest lumps of time go, as you can see by that difference crossing the line.
Okay, so now I've seen it visually. Can you use the data screen to explain to me what's happening, please?
Right, let's go to data now and have a look at that. A thing I found recently which really does help to explain it a lot. Effectively, the information on this y-axis up here is essentially all the values, the things like how much you've got the throttle open, how fast you're going, how many revs, etc. So this is obviously quite important. But the bottom line, the bottom trace here, or the bottom axis, currently at the moment it's on a timeline. Effectively, you've got your dotted line down there, your dotted line down there, that is the lap itself. So that speed trace is how long the lap took. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to drop into it, and there's no other traces I'm going to drop in at the moment. We're going to drop in from another session. Now if you're going for another session, you have to bring in another file. So let's bring in, this is about session 3 or session 4 from the first day. Now that's the lap itself. Now it's, as you can see, it's slightly blurred, so what we need to do now is effectively zoom in on this section here. This is where we cross the line. This is where the datum really starts. You can see the text currently on the blue line which I've brought in, which is the slower lap, is highlighted, and if I click on the red one, it highlights that. So I can actually move the red one now, the red trace, and if I click on the blue, I can then move the blue trace. So what you need to do is ultimately zoom in to start off with. As you can see there, we're still miles out. So if we zoom in a bit more, click on the red one, and we'll try and just drag that so that the timelines become absolutely bang on. So once again now, if we to check that that's crossing the same line, if you press your space bar, it brings on effectively all the values. Now if you go over to here, now this is the speed trace, so we're looking for a time here. So the time is 0.2 of a second, so it's 0.219, 0.219, so it's exactly bang on, crossing the line at exactly the same speed. This is actually what's happening on the bike from a time frame, because the bottom trace here is the actual elapsed time, what's actually happening from a time perspective. And as you can see, we've crossed the line at exactly the same point on the track, exactly the same time. And then as you can see, going round the lap, the red trace is actually arriving on the timeline slightly earlier every corner, which effectively what you're doing by the time you get to the end of the lap, which is up this end of the scale, you've compressed that timeline, where the blue line, which is the slower lap, has been slightly stretched, whichever way you want to look at it. You can obviously see there's a difference in time there. But what you start to struggle with at this point is figuring out, well, what was happening to make that difference. Now, this is where I found, instead of using the timeline, is used what's this one here, which is the distance plot.
Oh, because the length of the lap never changes.
The length of the lap is exactly the same. It's, you know, you can do 1,000,000 laps and it's always going to be the same distance.
Unless you're weaving around.
Unless you're weaving around a lot, or you kind of miss a corner out, which is kind of cheating anyway. So if we line these up again, this is exactly the same data from the slower lap and the faster lap, basing it on being the same distance, the lap. This helps dramatically between the timed lap, because what it highlights here is the slower lap, which is the blue trace. You can see from a speed perspective, because up here is your miles per hour speed, you can see that the red trace, I'm basically getting taller. I'm going faster in lots of places, and that is essentially where the faster lap comes from, is travelling faster at this particular point on the track. Okay, you can argue, yes, I'm going faster there. Well, how did that happen? What did I do which made me go faster at that one particular point? It's at this point that you have to start bringing in other traces, or look at the actual physical data to try and understand what's going on. If we bring the cursor up onto the screen, now you can see the crosshairs now, which is kind of following along, and it's actually following the blue trace, which is the slower line. So if I want to look at what we were doing on the red trace, if I go and click on the red trace at the bottom and then go back to that, the cursor will now be following the red trace. Now if we come over to this side of the screen, this here, your GPS speed, is wherever that cursor is on the line, on the red line for argument's sake, is what speed we're doing at that one point. So that's what's actually happening over here. So one of the easiest things to do for me is I would now bring in the throttle trace. Now with a fly-by-wire bike, there's effectively two traces you're bringing in. What you're bringing in is what your hand's doing, and the other trace will be what the actual bike is doing, what the ECU is allowing the bike to have. Let's say, for instance, you've got a big angular lean, you get a big fistful of throttle. You might have the throttle pinned, so you're thinking, happy days, on full gas. But you can bet your bottom dollar you will not be on full gas percentage of throttle at the back wheel, because the ECU will be kind of cutting it out quite a bit. So what I tend to do here is I'll bring in now a trace which will show us the throttle opening from what the actual, how much power is getting down to the back of the bike, not particularly what my hand's doing.
What you're calling traces are data channels.
Data channels, yes, we're bringing them in. So let's bring in actual throttle opening. Now you can see there, grip position is what my hand's doing, and throttle percentage is what the bike's, the engine ECU's allowing to happen. So we're going to bring that in, and 117 here effectively is the red line. So we need to bring in the throttle position by making it visible there on the red line. And if we drop that down to 114, which is the slower trace, and as you see it's disappeared there, but we bring it back on. Now you'll see at the bottom here now, when I click that, a blue trace will appear. So we've now got two throttle traces on there. One is the blue trace is following again the slower lap, the red trace the faster lap. Now over here on the values scale, the red fastest lap and the blue slower lap. So what we can do is cursor's now following the throttle position. But if you want to make it go onto the speed trace, go and click on the GPS and it will jump up to the speed trace, and it's actually, because the red is highlighted, it's following the red trace. So it's now, what am I doing with the throttle when I'm on the faster lap. Now an extra thing you can bring into here, which is I think worthwhile doing, the actual speed difference. We'll put a line on there, show either a speed loss or a speed gain by a long progressive drop off or increase depending on how you've got it set up.
When you say speed gain, you mean a faster lap?
A faster lap, yes.
And a speed loss means you've done a slower lap? A
slower lap, yes. So if we bring in the channels again, and it's the very last one, it's right at the very bottom, and it's, see, time difference. So if we make that visible, now we'll need to bring it in onto the other channel as well, which is 114.
So this is just a visual representation,
yeah,
of the difference being at any particular point on the track.
Yeah. Start finish line, which is where the cursor is now, finish line, which is back here, and the two traces, the red trace to go over it again is the faster lap, the blue trace is the slower lap, and as you can see this line here, it's steadily dropping off, so effectively I'm losing time throughout the lap.
By going faster.
By going faster, yeah. So it depends on what trace you want to be following. If you're following the blue trace, essentially you're losing time, where on the faster lap you're gaining time. So again, even that, talking about it, you've got to get your head around the perspective of what this line is actually telling you. So you can see here, if that line stayed absolutely level for the entire screen and it joined over there with the other line, that would be a horizontal line. It would be two absolutely identical laps. Because I've lost time
by going slower,
this line is descending, so I'm actually losing time throughout the lap. But you can actually see here the line isn't that far out of being horizontal, so the speed loss here is actually very small. Where it starts to drop away is after you've gone round this corner here. And to help you understand where you are on the circuit, if you look down here, you've actually got a map of the circuit with the corners numbered. And if you use your cursor up here and then press your space bar, you can now click on any one point on the track, which is for argument's sake here, and then bring it down to then click again, and you've got a measurement tool. Now you're measuring the distance or time, whichever you've got set up at the moment, or we're measuring distance from where I've eased off the throttle to where I've arrived at the apex of turn 2. And as you see down here on the screen, you've got a blue dot, which is where that first trace is up here, and a second blue dot, which is where the second marker was. So that distance there is essentially that portion of the track. So we're looking at essentially at a section of the track now. Going back to your cursor again, we need to look at what we're doing with the throttle at any one point in time. Now the faster lap, what I've done here, as you can see, I've actually shut the throttle earlier, but the progressional drop off, I've kind of eased back on the throttle. So the rate of throttle roll off, it's more like a roll back off the throttle. Where the slower lap, I've kept the throttle on longer, so you think normally, traditionally that would be great, but what I've done is I've snapped the throttle quickly off, so the rate of the throttle going off is much faster. So effectively on the slower lap, which was when I was getting used to the track, I've shut the throttle off really quickly and thought, Jesus, and I've managed to get through the corner. As I've smoothed that corner out, I've kind of rolled the throttle back. The after effect of this is where you see that line dropping off. That line here, which is your speed trace, is a much steeper descent to start with than that rolling trace. So that's where the speed gain, the actual speed gain and the time loss is starting to happen there, in that the fact that I've got more speed at the same point on the track.
Oh, so by being too aggressive with the throttle, without being smooth, you've actually lost time.
If you shut the throttle, you've got a big brake, which is the engine brake. So rolling the throttle back, you've effectively rolled the throttle off. Even though you're not braking, you're slowing down using the engine in a much more progressive fashion. Where when I shut the throttle off quickly, it's like you've jammed the back brake on, and I'll lose speed faster. Which sometimes you do. Going into a hairpin, it's all about getting rid of speed really fast. Turn 1, for instance, because it's a really fast section of the track, you don't particularly want to kill a load of speed immediately. You kind of kill the speed off going through the corner, so it's a progressional drop off. And if we look at the speed, for instance, as we go to the point where we kind of throttle back, the throttle are similar, but the speeds are actually almost identical, 257.3 against 255. So at that point in time, we're travelling more or less the same speed. But as we've left the fast kink, this really high speed kink, going through what is effectively the kink of turn 1, the gap is more or less the same. So I'm doing quite well there. But because I've slammed the throttle shut and effectively I'm decelerating a lot faster, a little bit further round the corner on the approach towards the kink, you can see the difference is starting to open up speed-wise now. It's 212 against 227. So there's exactly the same point on the track, because this is showing me here 505 metres against 504 metres. That's more within a metre. That's the same point on the track. Yeah, I'm doing 15 kilometres. This is in kilometres. I'm doing 15 kilometres an hour faster. So you can imagine two bikes side by side. The faster bike would be literally driving away or pulling away, even though you're actually slowing down going into the corner because of that extra speed that you're sort of carrying into the corner. Now, you can see here the speed traces are starting to sort of catch up on top of each other. I'm actually slowing down faster now with the red trace because we're now approaching a kink, the hairpin itself, or turn 2 itself. The speed traces close up there. So if we were looking at on the timeline now, that at this point in the track there'd be a separation because we were actually using time as the marker, not distance. We're actually at the same point on the track, and this is why I like using the distance trace or the distance plot to get a more accurate exactly what we're doing at that one point on the track.
And would you use this to help you learn for your next session?
That's exactly what you would do. I would be sitting in the garage now and I'll be saying, okay, what the bike felt like is something that you can use potentially, but it's not until you actually see, because the difference going through the corner visually doesn't look a massive amount different. There's a difference, yes. It probably doesn't feel hugely different, but you've got those two things to fall back on. But where it really highlights the difference is the speed trace. But you've got to understand how that happened, and they all happened by essentially that rapid closing of the throttle as opposed to rolling the throttle back, which carried that. You can see the shape of the arc there. The red is a much more the faster line is a much more steady drop off. Where the blue trace, it's more of a peak. And as you see further down in the lap, there's other losses here. As you see by the cursor here, you see there's a huge blip there in speed because it's kind of a long opening out corner and then you drop into a tight right. So you come out of turn 4 round over a slight rise, and I've punched the throttle there and then gone for a hard brake, and that's why you see a big difference there in the speed trace. As you can see, I get to a peak going through that corner speed wise of 143, where the slower trace it's down at 130. So you can see there alone there's 17 kilometers an hour difference. That's unusual. When you look at the rest of the laps, there's differences here and there, but that's a big lump. So what I would do is I would go and look on the lap to find out what caused that. So if we go back to the video screen now and we roll round to that corner, and can anyone spot what the problem was? A back marker. So because at this point, as I'm accelerating out the corner, I'm thinking to myself, my rate of closure there is quite high. I'm an overly taken rider, so I've got to not just nudge the guy out the way. I've got to pass him safely and give him plenty of slack. So I'm trying to assess that as I'm coming round the corner. So effectively, where I would normally be accelerating hard, like on the red trace, I've kind of flattened off a little bit and I'm being cautious on the approach. And of course, if you look at the throttle traces here, faster line, I'm actually accelerating with the throttle, where on the blue trace, it's much lower, a tremendous amount lower. In fact, there's a peak going round that corner, if we look at it, of throttle position 62% against 34%. So you can imagine the difference in that almost double the amount of throttle. That's why that kind of peak happened. So that's just two illustrations, hopefully, on how that speed difference happened, where it happened, and using the other traces, filling in the hole with what made the difference, essentially. Further on round the lap, you can see the speed traces are virtually the same. 217.7 against 219.7. That's 2 kilometers an hour, which is virtually the same speed. And that is matched by the two throttle positions down here are both flatlining. They're both at 100% throttle, so there's nothing to be gained or lost there. And because I apex the corner more or less the same speed as well, I've carried that speed down the straight. So that's why the speed traces going down that straight are pretty much the same. Where when you come out of turn 2 through turn 3, which is that bit there, and then the run down the hill, that's why the speed, when I shut off going into turn 4, with the shutdown point there, that's why there's a fairly big difference in speed there, because I've effectively, if we go back to look at on the video, I made a better job out of coming out of the slow corner. I was in a better track position. I passed through turn 3 carrying a higher corner speed, and that extra corner speed that you've taken through the corner, you take onto the straight. And because effectively both of the throttles are fully open on both bikes there, or on both timelines, any extra speed that you've taken through the corner, you take down the straight, and you're never going to make that time up because both bikes are flat out. If you were on a faster bike on the slower lap, you could probably gain some time back, but that's not what it's about. For me, a revelation happened about simply these two time plots that use the time plot against the distance plot, because the time plot is a great way to visualize. You can actually see it's like a digital version of watching the video, where using the distance plot makes effectively the laps the same length, and it condenses everything up so that you can then highlight the actual speed difference, and then you try and analyze where the speed difference came from.
So if we were to add a brake pressure channel onto this graph and throttle, would you see that you use the brake differently?
Yeah, of course. You tend to, when you're learning a track, tend to sort of be softer on the throttle, a bit later picking the throttle, a bit softer, tend to roll off earlier, softer on the brakes and a bit earlier. So it's a little bit kind of smooth landscape. And as you start to get more confident in the track, you start to compress that line up, which means basically you go for the brakes a lot harder. So you need to, look at both. I just use the throttle trace to start to analyse potential differences. What I would do then is have a look at the brake channel differences. Well, what I've brought up here now is I've turned off the throttle position, because if you have throttle position and brake position and something else, and because you've only effectively got the two colours, it all tends to get really confused from a visual perspective. You've always got, of course, the actual data, which is good here, but what you've got to try and picture also is physically what's happening, and then visually what the difference is.
So now we're looking at when you're on and off the brakes.
So yeah, it's the traces, the speed traces are the same from before. Blue lap is the slower lap, red lap the fastest lap. This line here is the rate of loss, what you time-wise is what you're losing. And what I've put up here is to show the difference in how hard I'm braking. I was going faster through the fast kink on towards the first kink of turn 1 and turn 2 itself. So I've got to get rid of more speed in the same distance. So that's a mechanical thing. If you're going faster, you've got to slow down to the same point on the track. You've got to use more brakes. And that's exactly what you see here on the two brake traces on the bottom. You can see at any one point in time there, I'm pulling 7 bar on the fast lap, where I'm pulling 3 bar on the slower lap. So I'm actually braking harder to get rid of that extra speed to arrive at the same point on the track and still make the corner. And as you see, for the rest of the lap, you've got another, this is the drop down into turn 4, as you see on the little telltale here. Because I'm going faster, but I'm arriving at the same apex effectively, I've got to get rid of more speed, so the brake pressure is higher. So I'm actually braking harder, and I'm braking harder into turn 4 and turn 5. And almost everywhere on the lap, I'm actually having to brake, because I'm going faster generally speaking, I'm having to brake harder at the same point on the track. And that in a sense shows a progressional increase in brakes, but from the timeline perspective, I've also got rid of a lot more time. So I've compressed the timeline, yet the distance plot, of course, is always going to be the same. So I would suggest bring in extra channels to look at what you're doing with brakes, look at what you're doing with throttle. You can bring in your bank angle, how much you're leaning the bike over. But what you'll tend to find with that is it'll be pretty similar, because the shape and the speed going through the apexes of all the corners, as you can see, is fairly similar for most of the corners. So you'll tend to find that bank angle will be pretty similar for most of the situations. So bring in channels which you can understand, but I would suggest bring them in one at a time to show, if you do bring it in all together, how you can fairly quickly end up with heaps of information, but visually it all starts to get a little bit confusing down the bottom. I mean, to be fair, the actual values in the table will remain the same. Even if there's no trace there, you'll still have the value. A couple of illustrations trying to show you how to use data to fill in the gaps between what you see on the screen, what you see on the video, and what you feel, trying to pull it all together.